Rana Bojo, no shaman Indigenous class, Gaye, Mainga, and Dodem, Lani Lamape, Kwe, and Dao. I'm happy to be here with you this afternoon in this format, as was said earlier, from the Lenape Nation in southwestern Ontario. And I prepared this presentation focusing on the cultural foundation. And I want to talk about that in terms of crystal meth impacts on the brain. My objective for presentation in this way is to decolonize Indigenous knowledge, to help people understand that an Indigenous worldview is rich with science, and we have ways of knowing how we can draw upon that science, and then also to facilitate a greater understanding among Indigenous people that we have a way of knowing, and we sometimes get overwhelmed with fear when we see lots of the impacts in our daily life right in front of us. Our children and grandchildren are suffering. We have, out of that reaction, wondering about how do we best help. So that's the objective for my presentation format. And as was said earlier, we have in Canada these two national frameworks, the Honoring Our Strengths, and the second one, the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Model. Whenever situations like this arise, what do we do about crystal meth? What do we do about methamphetamine? These two frameworks are the voices of Indigenous people, First Nations people across the country. And these two frameworks still apply in all of those different contexts, whether we're talking about cannabis, or whether we're talking about opioids, or whether we're talking about methamphetamine. We have to bring these frameworks forward to help us understand what's the path forward, who are the partners and the players that can help us understand what the solutions are. So I want to mention these frameworks because they apply. And then the third one on your screen is Indigenous Wellness Framework. And I believe that whenever we're talking about an issue and thinking about solutions, we have to be guided by the vision. And in this case, the Mental Wellness Continuum Framework says at the very center, hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose. So as we address the issues around crystal meth, we have to be thinking about how do we create hope in a situation where people are feeling overwhelmed and destitute. How do we create a sense of belonging for people who are using drugs and address the stigma, discrimination, and the lack of inclusion in the healthcare system that attends to their whole health and not just the drug using behavior, and then meaning and belonging. Everybody has a spirit that describes what is the meaning of life, what is the meaning of their life, and what purpose are they meant to fulfill on this earth that never goes away just because they're using drugs. And so these frameworks are critically important in this conversation. And so our evidence base as First Nations people come from our stories of creation. And this is one statement that is a common thread in those stories, and that is the Creator imagined the most beautiful and perfect place where life would grow. That becomes our mandate. How do we ensure that we attend to crystal meth beyond the input for the individual? What do we do about the crystal meth? How do we treat it? To be thinking about how the community is affected and how can the community be supported in answering how is the family being impacted and how can they be attended to as well, so that we are creating an environment that supports life no matter where people are on the spectrum of addressing issues that they're facing in life. So here's an example of how the creation story plays out in our reality. And I use the example of the drum. So the sound of the drum engages and stimulates all regions of our brain to act in unison. That's an understanding that's held within Indigenous languages. And from that sound and the interaction, then it creates an order to the flow of life, meaning how our brain responds to our environment, the chemical flow, how it informs our living, breathing, all of our functions, but also how we respond to the environment around us. So, for example, a lot of people, when they go to a powwow or they hear drumming and singing, all of a sudden they feel themselves overwhelmed with a sense of wanting to cry. And maybe it's a cry that they're not feeling, that they don't really understand. And so their expression is, wow, that was overwhelming. I don't understand why I feel like crying. But what's happening for people, and this is again coming from Indigenous knowledge, is that there's a sense of balance being created. There's a sense of connectedness being created. And so the sound of the drum is believed to be that spiritual connection. And it's your own spirit that is connecting to the spirit of the drum, connecting to the sound of creation. And so sometimes it causes people to feel that overwhelming sense of wanting to cry. But it's a healing energy that people feel. Again, from our creation story, we know that the stars are concepts. They're a pattern. And we can see those concepts and those patterns reflected in our syllabics, in our writings about our traditional knowledge and teachings. But there's a whole knowledge system about the star realm and what that means. And it comes from, again, our stories of creation, that the Creator thought about everything that would be needed to live this good life. And those thoughts went out into the darkness, and where they imprinted, they left a pattern, and that becomes our star galaxy and our star realm. That same kind of pattern is repeated in our neurons, in our cells. And so our cell system is a pattern that reflects those thoughts of the Creator at the beginning of time. In our language, there are words that are not just a word that describes one piece of information. Indigenous languages, their words are full concepts. And so in the language, there are concepts that describe how these cells work and their connection within our body. So the understanding about our DNA and the patterning that happens there. So our DNA, what makes up our being, the seeds of life, are continuously unfolding, and nurtured by the environment around us, they find expression. And they're also impacted by the environment around us. But the physical side of DNA is one piece, but there's also a spiritual layer to our DNA. And so whatever we are doing to support a whole and healthy person and an environment around that person has to attend to the spirit. And the Honoring Our Strength Renewal Framework says that we have to be spirit-centered as we think about addressing substance use issues amongst First Nations people in Canada. Again, building on our creation story. So that star pattern is the gifts that informed our DNA. So the stars, the spirit energy, were the seeds of life that became our DNA and was thread together. The next part of our creation story, I'm skipping over tons of information, but just pointing out some key pieces that apply to this conversation, is connection. In the Indigenous Wellness Framework, in emotional wellness, it talks all about the importance of connection to family, community, and relationships. And when it talks about relationships, it's not just talking about relationships with people, it's talking about relationships with our environment, the earth. The teaching is about how we come into the earth and how we connect with our original mother. And so in this example, it's about connecting to the earth by touching our feet to the earth. This is a picture of my grandson who had a lot of difficulty coming into this world. And so when he finally arrived and he was able to come home, this is a picture of us touching his feet to the earth because it ensures life. It sounds like a very simplistic act, but it has much more meaning to it. So when we think about people who are using drugs and where are they, they're not going to be people in our communities who are going to come knocking on the health center door. They're not going to go to the clinic in downtown, wherever, and say, hey, I'm here, I need some help. They are people that live on the margins of our society because of lots of the experiences, the intergenerational trauma, stigma, discrimination, racism. Maybe they haven't had anywhere to live, and so they're homeless, and their hygiene or their ability to connect with people. There's lots of barriers that get in the way of help seeking. And so we have a responsibility then to establish a connection by reaching out to them. And so when our children arrive in the world, the community accepts the responsibility to dress them up with their strengths, their gifts, and their identity. That's the same teaching, the same principle, the same action is required when we are reaching out, when we have to reach out to people who are using drugs, and in this case, crystal meth. I know there's lots of concern around psychosis and violence, and when does it happen, and how do I protect myself? But I want to use the creation story and some of those basic teachings in there to help us understand about the patterns of knowledge that continue to unfold and form our thinking around how we manage crystal meth, a synthetic chemical. It's man-made. It's not meant to be ingested, so it has a different effect on our body. Whereas when we use medicines that are man-made, they're synthetic, but they mirror the natural medicines. Our body can handle that. But when it's man-made, not meant for ingestion, there's a ton of issues that arise. And so in crystal meth, people find all kinds of ways to mix chemicals and use things that they are aware of to produce this drug. And then they go through a process of preparing it, which can also lead to other risks in the environment and to themselves as they are cooking all of these products together. It raises other risks of harm, so accidental harms, in addition to the harms that are created by ingesting such things as battery acid, drain cleaner, fuel, and antifreeze that were not made for our bodies. Our bodies can't ingest or digest and with these chemicals. So this next picture is a picture of the central nervous system. And I think in our communities, we haven't had the resources and the capacity to talk a lot about the neuroscience of addiction and what happens to our brain and how does our brain inform the rest of our being to be able to respond to medicines, drugs, alcohol, whatever it is. But in this current environment with whether it's opioids or methamphetamines, I think we have to have those conversations. And we have to have it in a way that honors Indigenous knowledge to help connect. And so in conversations that Thunderbird has had with Indigenous knowledge keepers, elders, and cultural practitioners, we've asked them, what knowledge do we have in our culture that helps us to understand what is the response to crystal meth? And they always go back to their words and their language that talk about medicines, that talk about the brain system, that talk about the impact of the environment on how our body functions. And so I have this big circle and it's highlighting the synapse. And in the synapse is critically important in this conversation around drugs. These neurons, they are like a communication system within our bodies. They send messages in the form of chemicals that control our movements, our actions, and our responses to the environment. But in this piece here in the synapse is where the drugs like crystal meth, man-made things, have a lot of impact. And so going back to Indigenous knowledge then, it's what language do we have that talks about the synapse? And there's many words and there's many concepts that help us to understand this space that relate. And the space in between, within the communication system, within our central nervous system. And so when we use medication, good medication, or when we use substances that can be very harmful to us, they have an impact here. And so we have to understand what impact does it have and understand what is the intervention in this regard. So with the example of opioids, we know there are definite pharmacological approaches, methadone or Suboxone or buprenorphine naloxone, and it has an impact in this space here. So it can help us to manage the withdrawals that are affecting our whole being so that we can think about recovery. The question with crystal meth is there a pharmacological approach? What medicines do we use? And how do we use them? What do they address? So this understanding of the central nervous system and the flow of information, chemical flow of information, how it gets blocked, how it's facilitated through medicine is something that we have to understand and not be afraid of. All that to say is there are words in Indigenous language that talk about that and inform our way of thinking about how do we influence that or treat it in this situation. It's also important to understand that these two types of drugs have different impacts on us. So opioids is a sedative, and the impact of that is it can take our breath away. People can stop breathing, and that's typically what we call a death by overdose. With stimulants such as crystal meth, it speeds everything up. And the impact of that, the overdose, is stroke, heart attack, and can lead to death. When people use the two together, because Indigenous people do use both of them together, there's a reason for that. In many First Nations communities, because they didn't have access to treatment for the opioid addiction, they started to create their own answer to manage the withdrawals. And there was tons of crystal meth labs that popped up. And so depressants help you to go to sleep. They slow down things. People use it to deal with intergenerational trauma. In our communities, a lack of resources and a lack of capacity to address intergenerational trauma. And so people get addicted to opioids and they're able to go to sleep and not deal with those kinds of situations. But then they got to wake up. They have to be productive. They have to feed their children. They have to do things that their family is requiring them to do, that are dependent upon them to do. And so they use crystal meth to be able to wake up and function. There's different stages of crystal meth use. And I put them in a circle here to help us understand that we have lots of questions about these different stages. What are the impacts of them? How do we help? Is there a specific stage where we intervene? Is there a specific stage that's more risky than the other? Where does psychosis show up, and where does violence show up? And we have lots of questions, but we don't have enough conversation. And so one of the first things I want to say to you is that critically important is having a conversation, and with each other, with our families, within our communities, and thinking about, again, who are the language speakers? Who has language that helps to understand concepts in our knowledge system that can help address and support people who are using crystal meth in any one of these stages? And so the first stage is the rush. And people describe the rush and the high, the next stage, like no other drug. And so the drug itself produces such a euphoria that when people are using the drug, it's hard for their system and psychologically to let go of it. And so people talk about it, once you use it, is like having chains and shackles on your life, because then you're tied to that drug and it gets more progressive because the high continues and you have to keep using. So the binge is you have to keep using additional doses to maintain that high. And it's like everything else. The more you use, the more you want. It gets to a point where they've reached a ceiling and it kind of like maxes out, and then their body starts to react. So often that's called the tweaking stage, where they don't have much control over their body because all of those chemicals that can't naturally be processed by our body in that synapse, one simple way of thinking about it is just recycling. And I want to say also that some of the same issues that we're seeing with crystal meth are the same issues that we have seen and dealt with inhalant abuse, the gas sniffing, the point in time where there's uncontrollable behavior, there's violence, and we're afraid of people. It's hard to connect with them because they appear to be psychotic. They're having hallucinations. And so in that environment, we're less likely to engage with them. But elders have talked about helping people when they're in that psychotic stage because they're concerned about their safety. Not their own safety, but the safety of the person who is using crystal meth. I heard a grandmother say in Saskatchewan when we were talking about crystal meth that she was working with somebody on the street, and in his psychosis, in his high, in that tweaking stage, he all of a sudden grabbed her and held a knife to her throat. And she said she didn't react. She talked to him in a calm voice. She talked to him in the language. And she just kept repeating his name. And talking in the language, she said, got his attention. And he didn't move any further in his actions with that knife. And when he snapped out of it, he said, oh my God, Auntie, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what I was doing. And so we know that the way we respond is critically important. And there's good evidence that says respond with a quiet environment. When people are using crystal meth, they're not eating, they're not drinking. It turns off that part of the brain that tells us naturally, oh, I'm hungry, I should eat. I'm tired, I should sleep. All of that goes away because of the crystal meth effects. And then those withdrawals are difficult to manage without any support or without any help, whether it's medicine or whether it's people. The withdrawal cannot be managed on its own. And there is no other health condition where we tell people, oh, you have cancer? Good luck with that. Just handle it on your own. And in this condition, this is a chronic illness addiction, and we have to be thinking about people's right to health. So how do we minimize the long-term harm? Because if we do nothing, if we just go with the stigma that people did this to themselves, you have to manage and tough out those withdrawals, then we have to be prepared to address the results of that, which is impact on the heart and also issues in terms of brain damage, the memory loss, their ability to recover. If we do nothing that includes spirit, we also create the situation where it's difficult for recovery. And so there's also the risk that comes along with needle sharing, increased rates of Hep C. Different communities have talked about that. We used to have less than 10 cases a year related to hepatitis C, and now we're seeing 40% of our population. Yesterday, I was in community and someone was saying we're 4% of the Canadian population, but we're 40% of the population living with HIV. And so this is a result of needle sharing. And I also want to emphasize that recovery is possible, and that the mistake that a lot of people made when we're talking about inhalant abuse, gas sniffing, glue sniffing, was that the message was once the brain damage is there, it's not possible to recover. But we know that it's absolutely possible to recover. In a study that was done in Mexico around inhalant abuse that they did with mice, they created an environment, natural environment, and they saw the brain cell regeneration happen in that natural environment. And so for First Nations people, if we create an environment, again, that nurtures life and supports life from an Indigenous perspective, connection to the land, connection to family and community, outreaching to them without judgment and discrimination or stigma, it is possible to get people engaged in their own recovery, and the brain can recover as well. So Eduardo Duran asked this question that in order to address addictions, you have to understand that addictions is a symptom of something that is missing. So what is it that's missing for Indigenous people? And we've had lots of strategies that, and this is what the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework says, that we cannot ignore culture as a foundation. It has to be central in what we do. We also have to understand that there are withdrawals. And when I go back to that circle that I presented earlier, we have to be ready to intervene in a safe way with a focus on safety for people who are using crystal meth at any point in time, but do it in a way that makes sense for everybody involved. So the meth high, it has definite psychological effects. And this is the piece that often causes fear the most, causes us to reject people, causes us to be angry with them. But we have to understand that in addition to that, it can affect them in terms of overdose and death. It can cause heart problems. It can cause seizures. It can cause death. And there are First Nations people that are talking about heart infections that are caused because of needle sharing. And with crystal meth is also the use of opioids. And when we mix, as I said earlier, the use of heroin and methamphetamines, it's a dangerous situation on the person that is using drugs. And so we have to think about what is the treatment method. We have lots of pride in Canada amongst First Nations for how we address alcohol use. And at one time, the data from the First Nations Information Governance Center on the Regional Longitudinal Health Survey said that there is more abstinence amongst First Nations people in Canada compared to the Canadian population. A lot of pride for how we've addressed alcohol use from a whole community approach. The way we addressed alcohol, while we have lots of pride in that, is not the same way that we have to address opioids and crystal meth. The same methods will not work. We have to be able to apply a solution that is specific to the needs related to the substance that is being used. And so we have to think about what access do Indigenous people have to services? How available are they? And when they are available, do they make sense for First Nations people? So the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime says that only 1 in 6 people in the world have access to treatment when they need it. And then I think about that and I wonder, what is access and availability for First Nations of services when they need them? Treatment centers, the National Native Alcohol and Drug Abuse Program, treatment centers are responding to the needs around crystal meth and opioids. Communities are doing what they can, elders and cultural practitioners, but there's a greater need and we can't keep up to it. There's lots of benefits if we tailor the response. And so we have to think about opioid agonist treatment. First Nations say, yeah, those medications, they do make a difference, but we also have to be thinking about our natural medicines and how they play a role. So it's not just knowledge and our cultural practices, but also the knowledge that we have of our medicines. And there are First Nations elders who are using natural medicines to assist in this environment of opioids and crystal meth. So there's lots of benefits to treatment of crystal meth. And first off, the evidence says that the environment, the treatment setting, how we set up that environment makes a big difference. We can't just think about the psychological interventions. We also have to be concerned about the impact on their health overall. And that there are good models, such as the matrix model, where rewards are given for small steps, small gains. It keeps people engaged. We can use cognitive behavioral therapy for helping people to navigate their negative thinking and develop coping skills. Motivational interview is basic active listening skills, validating people, letting them know that they're heard. And all of that is also included in ceremonial practices using Indigenous languages. So there are elders who are talking about working with communities, cultural practitioners and healers that are also working with community in ceremony, using the drum, the song, the language, their natural medicines to help individuals recover from crystal meth. How we set up the environment, it has to be a safe base. Using, land-based environments, our natural relationships to the land is a part of that. But a safe space where they're not going to be judged, where there's physical safety for them, as well as emotional safety and cultural safety, comfortable lighting, a calm environment. Everything that we know from our language talks about our connection to our environment, the physical environment, as well as emotional and spiritual environment. That connection, again, like I talked about earlier, is so critical in this conversation. And so outreach, helping people get to a safe space and nurturing space that is non-judgmental has great benefit. And then we have to be thinking, as people are going through the withdrawals of crystal meth, we have to be wondering and acting on the depression that is present and the suicidal ideation. How do we treat the anxiety, the agitation, and those kinds of things? And there are some studies that are occurring right now around CBD and THC content of medical cannabis, where it's having some positive impacts around these issues and helping people progress in their journey of recovery. We have to also think about addiction as a chronic disease. We're quite comfortable in understanding and accepting that there are relapse with other chronic health conditions. So, for example, there's a high rate of diabetes amongst Indigenous people, and yet we know there are complications that people have when they're not able, for whatever reason, to maintain a good path around their health care in relation to diabetes. It leads to other complications. But at no place along that path do we as a society or a healthcare system say to them, oh, that's too bad you did that. I'm sorry, you're going to have to, just suffer along with whatever the complication is. We always respond no matter how well we take care of ourselves. And so with addiction, it's critically important that we understand it's not ABC equals everything is fixed. People, depending again upon their connection to family, community, land, and environment, will have lots of progress and they might slip. And so we have to be prepared to support people all along the journey and not give up on them with, I tried, there's no use. We have to be committed to supporting. And that's, understanding what stigmas do we have about this substance, about people who use crystal meth. Stigma is an attitude. In some places, people describe stigma as a nice way of talking about racism. And so we have to be thinking about and challenging and addressing those barriers that get in the way from accessing safe care, relevant care, meaningful care to help people in their recovery. In communities, what we've heard makes the biggest difference is when our own governments are mandating a response from all of the community services. So if we have a nurse practitioner or a physician that's playing a role, if we have access to mental health support, if we have those kinds of resources, then the First Nations government can mandate under their sovereign authority to do so as a government, how those services will respond to people in their community. And we have to be concerned with not the intergenerational trauma, first off. We're not going to sit down and do counseling with these people and ignore their basic needs for sleep, for clothing, for personal hygiene, for other health risks and complications. We're going to connect with them first through outreach, including peer support, and attend to those basic needs first. At some place along the conversation, what are the pharmacological interventions that can help? Maybe in addition to our cultural approach, or maybe if a community is not ready for those things, then it's just that. But we have to be thinking about culture. The frameworks that I talked about earlier say culture is the foundation. And there are cultural practitioners who are using land, language, our sacred songs, our drums, and our medicines to help assist in this crisis of opioids and crystal meth. Working as a community to honor people in their healing who are seeking treatment, who are engaged in their own recovery without an expectation for abstinence. And that, again, comes from our thinking around alcohol. We had a heavy messaging and value for not using anything at all. We can't have that same discussion in this environment. It doesn't apply. It makes it too hard for people. And when we exclude or push them out based on this expectation of abstinence, we are increasing the harms to not only that individual, but to our whole communities. And as I said, that continuous ongoing support towards establishing purpose. That's what the Indigenous Wellness Framework is. When we look at the physical aspect of our being, if we invest in attending to those needs like food, housing, shelter, even the child welfare issues, we are supporting people in having purpose in their life, and that supports them in their recovery. We are doing all that we can to continue this conversation, having conversations in community with treatment center and around opioids and crystal meth, trying to understand the needs. And we have developed a national community-based opioid survey for adults and youth, which also looks at questions around crystal meth and the dynamics of the environment, our access to treatment, community attitudes and perceptions, methods of treatment and support, to help inform putting together some guidelines that can assist communities in their response. And what I'm not speaking to are those key messages from elders that I encourage you to have more conversations in your environment. Thank you.